Good morning and happy Sabbath. Today I will be sharing a message with you, and I have titled it God is in Control. So at our Women's Weekly Bible Study, we have been reading through the Gospel of John. Recently we read John 6, which tells the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000. And afterwards, the disciples being out on the lake without Jesus when an unexpected storm hits. The story of the disciples caught my eye because it feels like right now we are in the midst of a storm ourselves. This specific account is actually also found in Matthew 14 and Mark 6. But before we get into the story, there are a few things I want to point out first about the context. At this point in the Gospels, Jesus' cousin John, had been executed by Herod in order to appease his wife, and many of Jesus' disciples had been followers of John before they were followers of Jesus. And so this was a time of intense grief and sadness for all of them. Perhaps they felt similar feelings of anger, grief, and sadness that many of us are feeling with current events today. In order to grieve, Jesus and his disciples withdrew to a deserted place in the northeast corner of the Sea of Galilee in order to spend time alone. However, thousands of people had been wanting to see Jesus, and since this was about the time of Passover, there was people traveling from all over Israel and outside, all over the empire. And since they knew and had heard that Jesus had healed diseases miraculously, many of them wanted to see Jesus. Many followed him into the mountains. Although Jesus was feeling emotionally overwhelmed over his loss, he also realized that these people needed him. So he was moved with compassion for thousands of people, and he preached to them all day. And then, because there was no food in the area, he miraculously fed over 5,000 with 5 loaves and 2 fish. At this point, the people felt assured that Jesus is the Messiah. After all, he could raise the dead, he could heal the sick, he could feed thousands of people with virtually no food, and he was willing to stand up to corrupt a religious authority in the name of God. So they reasoned that with Jesus as their king and general, Israel could overthrow the Romans and rule the world. The disciples also felt like crowning Jesus and getting revenge on Herod. After all, they themselves had not had any time to emotionally process the death of John the Baptist. Although many of Jesus' disciples were merely fishermen, they felt that with Jesus as their commander, they could not fail to overthrow the murder of beloved John. However, this was not the reason that Jesus came into the world. This was not his mission. Jesus knew that if he did not do anything about it, the people would make him king by force, and there would be a lot of bloodshed done that was needless. So Jesus told the crowd to disperse, and he told his disciples to quickly get into the boat and leave the other side. So the trip here would have been from somewhere on this side of the Sea of Galilee and to Capernaum. That was approximately 2.5 to 3 miles, depending on which part of the lake they were coming from. So with the best estimates in rowing that I was able to find, this would have taken them 1 to 2 hours of rowing. Even in unfavorable conditions, the disciples would have been used to being on the lake, on the sea. They would have been able within a few short hours to be on the other side. They also would have been very familiar with the weather patterns in that area and would have presumably noticed storms approaching. However, they were so caught up in their grief that this just was not the case, and they sailed right into the midst of a storm. So this morning, I want us to take a look at a few verses in this story that have personally stood out to me. Like it was for the disciples, these last few weeks and months have been an emotional time. We've all been grieving loss of something. For me personally, this has been the loss of spending time with people, with my family, who is far away. And in a lot of ways, as the school year came to an end, I have recognized my students needed me. And so I wasn't always able to process grief in the same way that perhaps sometimes other people can. And this is true of many teachers that I have talked to as well. Recently, in the last week or so, I've been also deeply troubled by the senseless killings and everything that's going on in our world. And oftentimes, and Jonathan and I end up getting stuck in this cycle of watching current events and being focused on that, and then we create an emotional storm, in a sense, for ourselves, when this could have been avoided if we would have been focused not only of what we wanted, but also what Jesus or God had been asking us to do. In reading this passage in John, God has, to me, spoken about some things that helped me recenter and helped me realize just how much we need to keep that focus on God. So with these things in mind, let's go ahead and open up to John 6. We're going to be looking at verses 14 through 21. So let's start with verses 14 and 15. And it says, "When the people saw the sign he had done, they said, 'This really is the prophet who was come into the world.' Therefore, when Jesus knew that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself." So here Jesus sees the crowd, presumably including his disciples, on the Sea of Galilee, on the mountain, trying to make him king. The disciples and the people did not understand the true mission of the Messiah. At the beginning of the chapter, there is a second mention of the Passover in the Gospel of John. So this was at least 1 year about into Jesus' ministry, and although the disciples had spent all that time every day with Jesus, they still did not understand his ministry. I wonder how often we are at risk of not understanding the purpose and the goals that God has for us. When we are faced with uncertainty, it is so easy for us to blame things on God or wonder why this is happening, why he isn't in charge, why is God not taking care of this situation, why is he not answering our prayers. However, there are times when we misunderstand or forget that God doesn't promise us peace or safety in this world, but he does promise that he will be with us. This here is not our home, and the purpose is not to have everything perfect here, but to minister to others and give of ourselves so others can hear of God's love, purpose, and mission for each of us. So let's continue in verses 16 and 17. "When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into the boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. Darkness had already set in, but Jesus had not yet come to them." So Jesus sends his disciples to cross the lake to head to Capernaum. As I mentioned, it was a fairly short trip that should have taken a fairly short time. It was likely late in the afternoon when Jesus sent them off, but likely it was still light, at least even if it was early evening, because this mention of the evening coming and darkness setting in. Probably, and this is also supported by the Desire of Ages, that likely the disciples did not sail off right away, as Jesus asked them to, but rather they sat around waiting, dilly-dallying in a way, and hoping that Jesus would come to them. Personally, I have wondered that if the disciples would have set off right away as Jesus had asked them to, would they be in the midst of this storm? Would they have been caught in this storm, or would they have been across the lake when the storm hit? We, like the disciples, will often drag our feet when Jesus asks us to do something that is hard or we don't really want to do. That tends to be a little bit of our human tendency. We are not always really willing to obey Jesus, especially when it feels hard for us to do it. For us today, that may be getting too wrapped up in the news, or being preoccupied with our problems, or spending too much time with games and media. We need to be informed, and we need to find activities that are enjoyable and relaxing, and ways to spend time with our families that are fun. However, Jesus asks us to do things in order to not focus on us and our problems so much. He calls us to do different things, but perhaps he is asking us to call our friends or relatives. Perhaps he's asking us to help with things in our community, like food drives and other community service activities where we can be helping others. Perhaps it is to write letters, to pray for and with other people. Many times, however, we get so focused on what we're going through that we forget that God also desires for us to help others. And we lose sight in the process of what God is actually calling us and asking us to do in the present. Let's continue with John 6:18 through 21. Then a high wind arose, and the sea began to churn. After they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea. He was coming near the boat, and they were afraid, but he said to them, "It is I. Don't be afraid." Then they were willing to take him on board, and at once the boat was at the shore where they were heading. Several disciples had been fishermen at the Sea of Galilee. The lake was familiar, and they would have likely known the warning signs of big windstorms. However, it seems that the disciples were so lost in their thoughts that they did not recognize the warning signs. In Desire of Ages, we have Ellen White saying, they, the disciples, had left Jesus with dissatisfied hearts, more impatient with him than ever before since acknowledging him as their Lord. Their thoughts were stormy and unreasonable, and the Lord gave them something else to afflict their soul and occupy their minds. God often does this when men create burdens and troubles for themselves. The disciples had no need to make trouble. Already danger was fast approaching. How often are we like the disciples? We become fixed on our goals, on our ideas of what God's mission is and what that may look like, that we may work against God. We forget that God is ultimately in charge of our life and our world. In Mark's account of this story, he says that Jesus, from land, saw them straining at the oars, for the wind was against them, and very early in the morning he came toward them walking on the sea. We see that in one statement that Jesus knew where his disciples were and what their struggles were as well. Later on in the same chapter, Ellen White says, Jesus had not forgotten them. The watcher on the shore saw those fear-stricken men battling with the tempest. Not for a moment did he lose sight of his disciples. With deepest solicitude, his eyes followed the storm-tossed boat with its precious burden. For these men were to be the light of the world. As a mother in tender love watches her child, So the compassionate master watched his disciples. When their hearts were subdued, their unholy ambition quelled, and in humility they prayed for help, it was given them. Jesus does the same with us today. Sometimes he lets events pass around us to wake us up and to remind us that we are not the ones in charge. We like to be, but in reality, God is in charge, and we need to acknowledge that and live as if he were in charge. In the middle of our storms, Jesus still considers us his precious burdens, whom he wants to take the message of his coming to our world. Recently, it has felt that we are in the middle of the storm and that we will drown, but Jesus is much closer to us than we think. We might think we have nothing left, but God is there trying to strengthen our faith as well. We are living in a chaotic world today, and we have things that we are afraid of. For each one of us, that's different, but we still have things that we tend to be afraid of. No matter what goes in the world around us, and no matter the situations we face, at the end of the day, God is still in control. Just like Jesus was still in control when the disciples were on the lake in the midst of the storm, so he is still in control of our world today. Our job is not to question what God is and is not doing, but to focus on Jesus and have him direct our life. In Hebrews 12, verses 1 and 2, it says, "Let us lay aside every hindrance and the sin that so easily ensnares us. Let us run with endurance the race that lies before us, keeping our eyes on Jesus, the source and perfecter of our faith. For the joy that lay before him, he endured the cross, despising the shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God." I want us to focus on that for just a moment. Jesus is on the right hand of the throne of God. He is in charge. And this is ultimately God's mission for us, to keep focus on him and to let him be in charge and lead our lives and the world around us. Thank you, and hope you have a very blessed Sabbath.